The autumn air in Briarwood Heights, Colorado, was crisp and full of the earthy scent of fallen leaves. It was a neighborhood that seemed untouched by time, its winding streets framed by towering oak trees that blazed with the colors of the season, golden yellows, deep oranges, and fiery reds. Children laughed as they rode their bikes down the sidewalk, their voices filling the air with innocent joy. Everything in this suburban haven seemed perfect. But beneath the serene beauty of this new chapter in their lives, the Harris family was silently teetering on the edge of a precipice. David Harris had always prided himself on being the rock of his family. A successful businessman, his life was built on order, control, and precision. He was a man who liked to have everything in its place, his work, his home, and most importantly, his marriage. It was the cornerstone of his identity. Rebecca, his wife, was the perfect partner in every sense of the word. She was the calm in his storm, the balance to his ever-rigid world. Their marriage had been a whirlwind romance, one of late-night talks, shared dreams, and a feeling that they were invincible together. David often told her, "You complete me," as though the universe had brought them together in perfect harmony. But there was something about the air that day that felt different. The laughter of the children outside echoed in David's mind, but there was a gnawing unease creeping at the edges of his thoughts. It wasn't that he doubted Rebecca, he never could. It was just something. A feeling he couldn't quite place. He watched her from the doorway as she unpacked boxes in the living room, her graceful movements a stark contrast to the storm inside him. She was everything he had ever wanted in a partner, strong, beautiful, and full of life. She had been his refuge from the chaos of the world, and for that, he loved her deeply. Yet, as he stood there, a thought lingered in the back of his mind, like a shadow refusing to be dismissed. It was an uncomfortable thought, one he pushed away every time it resurfaced. He trusted Rebecca with every part of his soul. But what if, just beneath the surface, there was something about her he didn't know? Something buried deep within her that, if exposed, could shatter the delicate balance they had built together? Rebecca felt it too. The weight of her past, the secret she had carried for so long, pressed down on her every time she looked at David. Her hands trembled as she unpacked the box of photos, a box she had hoped would remain unopened. Each picture was a reminder of a time before, a time when she had been someone else. Someone David didn't know. A time that felt like it belonged to a different life altogether. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tucked the box away in the back of the closet. Her body screamed for release, but she couldn't. She couldn't let David see this, couldn't risk losing everything they had. Not yet. Not when things were finally so good. Rebecca paused, her fingers resting on the closet door. A wave of dread washed over her. How could she ever tell him the truth? What if the man she had fallen in love with couldn't love her back when he knew what she had once been? David's voice broke through her thoughts, calm and steady. "You okay?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The weight of her secret, her fear of being rejected, threatened to drown her. But she forced a smile, pretending everything was fine. "Yeah, just tired," she lied, her voice betraying nothing. But inside, the walls were starting to close in. And so, they continued, this delicate dance of silence, of unspoken truths. The peace of Briarwood Heights surrounded them, but neither of them could shake the feeling that something was about to break, and neither of them knew how long they could pretend. The days in Briarwood Heights drifted by with a sense of quiet monotony, the rhythm of suburban life carrying on like the tick of a clock. David and Rebecca settled into their new home with a sense of accomplishment. The house was beautiful, large, spacious, with wide windows that let in the golden autumn light, casting a warm glow over their lives. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But perfection, as they both knew, was fragile. For David, the routine was comforting. He poured himself into his work, often staying late at the office, convinced that the harder he worked, the more secure their lives would be. His career had always been a point of pride, a way of asserting control in a world that sometimes felt unpredictable. But even when he was at home, his mind wandered back to his projects, the pressure mounting on him to keep everything in line. Rebecca never complained. She was the steady anchor he needed, and that was enough, for now. But Rebecca felt the cracks beginning to show. She watched David as he disappeared into his world of spreadsheets and phone calls, the man she loved slowly slipping further away. He was there, physically, but emotionally, he was distant. She wondered if it was the weight of their new life, the responsibility of the house, the new beginning, or if it was something more. Could it be that David, despite all the love he had for her, was beginning to drift away? Was he sensing the gulf between them, the wall that Rebecca had built so carefully, a wall she feared would eventually collapse? As the days passed, Rebecca's anxiety grew. It was as if a quiet storm was brewing within her, a storm that no one could see, but that she felt every time she looked at David. She had tried so hard to bury her past, to leave it behind, but it haunted her. The small boxes tucked in the back of closets, the old photographs she couldn't bring herself to throw away, these were all reminders of who she used to be. She longed to share it with David, to finally lay bare the truth of her journey. But the fear of his rejection, the fear that he might see her differently, was a constant weight on her heart. One evening, while David was out late at a business dinner, Rebecca sat alone in their living room, staring at the empty walls. The house felt cold despite the fire crackling in the hearth. She thought of the day they had met, the whirlwind romance that had swept them both off their feet. She had been so sure then, sure that their love would be enough, that David would understand her completely, past and present. But now, that certainty was slipping away, replaced by a gnawing doubt. Could he still love her once he knew the truth? Would he see her as the woman she was now, or as the person she had been? The next day, while unpacking more boxes, Rebecca found a small silver locket buried under a stack of old papers. It was a gift from her late mother, one she had worn for years before her transition. She had kept it hidden, tucked away in her jewelry box, afraid of what it might symbolize. But now, holding it in her hand, she couldn't shake the sense that it was calling to her, urging her to take the next step, to stop hiding. She stared at the locket, feeling the weight of the decision she knew she had to make. David returned later that night, his tie loosened, the faint smell of whiskey on his breath. He smiled at her, but there was a tension in the air. They exchanged pleasantries, talked about their day, but there was something unspoken, something they both felt but neither acknowledged. Rebecca's heart raced as she placed the locket back in the drawer, hidden once again. She wasn't ready. Not yet. In the days that followed, small details began to build, moments where David seemed to catch her off guard. A photo from her past appeared while he was sorting through some boxes. A brief glance, a question about the picture, and then an awkward silence. He didn't press her for an answer, but the look on his face lingered in Rebecca's mind. Did he suspect something? Was he beginning to sense the walls she had built around herself? She couldn't tell, and the uncertainty gnawed at her every time they spoke. One evening, as the two of them sat together in their cozy living room, David casually asked, "Where did you get that necklace?" His voice was light, but his eyes were sharp. Rebecca froze, the question hitting her harder than she anticipated. "Oh, just something I had," she replied quickly, trying to mask the panic rising in her chest. "Nothing important." But her heart was racing, her palms sweating. She saw the way David's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he wasn't convinced. He didn't ask more, but the silence that followed felt heavier than it ever had before. Rebecca felt the walls closing in on her. She couldn't hide forever. The weight of her past was becoming unbearable, and she knew that eventually, it would all come to light. She just didn't know if she was ready for that moment, or if David would ever be ready for the truth. The storm inside her grew louder, threatening to break through, but she held on, trying to keep the facade intact. The days that followed were filled with tension, small moments of doubt and fear. David went about his day as usual, but the unease in Rebecca's chest never subsided. It was as if they were both waiting for something, waiting for a truth to come out, waiting for the perfect moment to confront what they both feared. The question wasn't if the truth would be revealed, but when. And with each passing day, Rebecca could feel the storm brewing. The longer she waited, the harder it would be. But there was no way out now. Sooner or later, everything she had been hiding would come crashing down. The evening had settled in with an almost eerie calm, the kind of silence that seemed to hang heavy in the air. David was in his study, surrounded by the scattered papers and reports of the day, but his mind was elsewhere. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right with Rebecca. It wasn't anything overt, nothing that could be easily pointed to, but rather a subtle shift, a small, nagging sensation that had settled in his chest. She was distant, more so than usual, and there were moments when she would look at him as though she were waiting for something. Waiting for him to ask the right question, waiting for him to figure it out. And then, it happened. As he rifled through a pile of unopened mail, David came across an envelope that immediately caught his eye. It wasn't the usual bills or advertisements, it was an old letter, yellowed and brittle with age. The name on the front, Rebecca Harris, was written in bold, elegant script, but there was something odd about it. The handwriting looked familiar, yet not quite the way he had seen it before. Curiosity gnawed at him, but a strange sense of foreboding settled in his gut. He opened the envelope, pulling out the letter inside. The first few lines made no sense. The writer spoke of a journey of transformation, the struggle of self-discovery, and a desire to live authentically. The words blurred in David's mind, but the significance began to hit him slowly, like a rising tide. The writer was describing a process of change, something profound, something that seemed to echo the very person sitting across from him every day. He flipped the letter over, and there, on the back, was a link to a social media post, one that talked openly about Rebecca's past. The world seemed to slow as David read the comments, references to her old identity and the struggles of her transition. His heart pounded, his head swimming with confusion, disbelief, and betrayal. His hands trembled as he put the letter down, unable to grasp the reality of what he had just discovered. The woman he had married, the woman he thought he knew inside and out, had kept such a monumental secret from him. And now, it was in black and white, a truth he had never suspected but was now impossible to ignore. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He walked toward the living room, his mind in a haze of questions and emotions. He had to confront her. He had to hear it from her lips, to make sense of the whirlwind of thoughts that now consumed him. Rebecca was sitting on the couch, her legs tucked under her as she absent-mindedly flipped through a book. The room was dimly lit, the warm glow of the lamp casting long shadows across her face. She looked up as David entered, her smile faltering slightly as she caught sight of his expression. "David? What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. There was a moment of stillness, a tension in the air that neither of them could ignore. David didn't answer at first. Instead, he held out the letter, the paper crinkling in his grasp. "Rebecca, why didn't you tell me?" His voice was low, controlled, but it trembled with a mixture of pain and disbelief. He watched as her face drained of color, her eyes widening in shock. "David," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to tell you. I just didn't know how." He could feel his heart racing, the confusion swirling inside him. "How long? How long have you been hiding this from me?" he demanded, his voice rising, unable to keep the raw emotion from breaking through. His mind was a whirlwind of questions, each one more urgent than the last. How could she keep this from him? How could she keep something so vital, so life-altering, locked away from him? "I never wanted to hurt you," Rebecca said, her voice cracking. She looked down, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "I thought, Maybe if I could just leave it in the past, I could be the woman you wanted me to be. The woman I want to be. David's gaze sharpened, his confusion turning to anger. The woman I wanted you to be? His voice was strained, incredulous. What does that even mean, Rebecca? I loved you, just the way you were. Why would you hide this from me? From the person who promised to share everything? Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly, trying to remain composed. I was scared, she whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. Scared that you wouldn't love me anymore, scared that you would see me as someone else. The words stung, more than he had anticipated. The pain in her voice was almost more than he could bear, but his own hurt pushed through, a tidal wave of betrayal he couldn't shake. You lied to me, he spat, the words bitter on his tongue. His chest tightened, his heart pounding painfully. You kept something so big from me. How could you think I would just not care? How could you think I would be okay with this? Rebecca stood up, her body shaking as she tried to close the gap between them. David, please, she begged, reaching for him, but he recoiled. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want to lose you. You were everything to me. I thought if I told you, you would leave me. Her voice was raw, desperate. And for a moment, David saw the vulnerability in her eyes, something he hadn't seen in so long. But it wasn't enough to quell the storm inside him. The shock of the discovery, the weight of the secret that had been hidden for so long, it was too much. The image of the woman he thought he knew was shattering before him, and he couldn't stop it. I thought we had no secrets, Rebecca, he said softly, his voice trembling with the effort to remain calm. But now, I don't know what to believe. The room seemed to close in around them. The walls that had once been a symbol of their shared life now felt like a cage, trapping them in this moment of unbearable tension. Neither of them knew where this confrontation would lead, but they both felt the heavy truth between them, the unspoken reality that something had been irrevocably broken. And in the silence that followed, David realized there was no turning back. The truth had been revealed, and nothing would ever be the same. The silence that followed their confrontation was deafening, an oppressive weight that hung heavily in the air. David stood frozen, his hands trembling at his sides, his mind a blur of confusion, anger, and betrayal. He had never imagined that the woman he loved, the woman he had built a life with, could harbor such a secret. The room felt smaller now, suffocating, as the tension between them swelled to an unbearable height. Rebecca stood a few steps away, her chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. The tears that had welled in her eyes were now threatening to spill over, but she held them back, her body rigid with fear. She had never seen David like this, his eyes were wide with disbelief, his jaw clenched in a mix of pain and rage. The distance between them, once an invisible thread of trust and love, now felt like an insurmountable chasm. David, please, just try to understand, Rebecca pleaded, her voice shaking. This was never about lying to you. It was about protecting us, about keeping what we have intact. But David was beyond listening. The flood of emotions swirling inside him had reached its peak, and the words spilled out of him like venom. Protecting us, he repeated bitterly, his voice rising with each word. You think keeping this from me was protecting us? You think hiding the truth is somehow protecting me? From you? From the woman I thought I knew? Rebecca flinched, but she didn't step back. She couldn't. She had spent so long keeping the truth buried that now, in the face of his anger, all she could do was stand there, her heart breaking under the weight of his words. David's hands clenched into fists, his entire body tense with frustration. The realization hit him with full force, everything they had shared, the intimacy, the late-night talks, the quiet moments they spent together, had been built on a foundation of lies. The life they had constructed felt hollow now, and the thought of how much he didn't know about her twisted like a knife in his gut. His voice grew more desperate, more frantic. How could you do this to me, Rebecca? He shouted, his chest rising and falling with each angry breath. We were supposed to be partners in this. I trusted you with everything. I gave you everything. And now, I feel like I don't even know who you are. Rebecca took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out a hand, her voice softer, filled with desperation. David, please, I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted to keep this from you forever, but I was so scared. Scared that you wouldn't love me anymore. That you'd leave me. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. David's eyes narrowed, his gaze hardening as the anger inside him bubbled to the surface. He stepped back, his fists still clenched at his sides. You think this is love? He demanded, his voice shaking with fury. You think hiding something so huge, so life-changing, is love? You think you can just keep it locked away and expect me to go on, pretending everything's fine? His breath came in ragged gasps as his frustration reached a boiling point. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one more painful than the last. He felt betrayed, not just by Rebecca, but by the world they had built together. It was as if the very foundation of their relationship had crumbled beneath him, leaving him standing in the rubble, unsure of what was real anymore. I can't do this. David yelled, the words coming out like a guttural cry. The intensity of his emotions exploded in a way that was uncontrollable, and in that instant, his anger reached a breaking point. Without thinking, without truly understanding the gravity of his actions, he lashed out. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat as she saw David move toward her. The moment felt suspended in time, his face twisted in anger, his body coiled like a spring. She froze, not sure how to react, not sure how to stop the storm that was building between them. She took a step back, but before she could process what was happening, David reached out and shoved her. The force of the push sent Rebecca stumbling backward, crashing into the side table. She lost her balance, her hands flailing to grab onto something, anything, to stop herself from falling. The edge of the table hit her side, and she cried out in pain as she fell to the floor. The sound of Rebecca's body hitting the ground echoed in the room, the suddenness of it ringing in David's ears. For a brief moment, everything went silent. He stood frozen, his chest heaving with the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. His eyes widened as he looked down at Rebecca, who was lying on the floor, clutching her side, her face pale with shock and pain. It was a moment of horror, of realization, that hit him harder than anything else had in their entire relationship. What had he done? Rebecca, David whispered, his voice trembling with regret. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over her as if afraid to touch her. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean. But Rebecca pulled away, her eyes filled with tears and fear. She didn't want his touch, not now. She couldn't look at him. Not after what had just happened. He had crossed a line, one that could never be erased, no matter how much he apologized. I can't stay here, Rebecca whispered through her tears. She slowly stood up, clutching her side as pain radiated through her. She had never seen David like this before, and she couldn't stay any longer. The man she had once loved had just broken something inside her, something irreparable. She could feel the fracture in their marriage, and it was growing wider with each passing second. Without another word, Rebecca turned and walked out of the room, leaving David kneeling in the wreckage of their once perfect life. The silence between them was now deafening, the rift between them vast and unforgiving. And neither of them knew how to bridge the gap that had formed in that instant. The consequences of their actions would reverberate through the rest of their lives, and there was no going back. The air in the house felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Rebecca retreated into the bedroom, her mind in turmoil. Her side throbbed where the table had hit her, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the ache in her heart. She had spent years building this life with David, and in one moment, everything had been shattered. The truth about her past had always been a weight she carried, but this, this was something she never expected. She hadn't just lost David's trust, she had lost the foundation of their relationship. Her mind replayed the moment over and over, the way David had looked at her, the venom in his voice, the way he had shoved her away as if she were nothing. He had crossed a line, one that couldn't be erased with apologies or tears. Rebecca stared blankly at the wall, her breath shallow, as the gravity of what had happened began to settle in. How had things gotten this far? She had tried so hard to protect their love, to protect him from the parts of her that she feared would drive him away. But in doing so, she had allowed the secret to fester, and now, everything she feared had come to pass. She had never imagined that David, the man she loved so fiercely, could treat her like this. The memory of his anger, of the harsh words he had thrown at her, cut deeper than any physical injury ever could. She didn't know if she could ever look at him the same way again. David sat in the living room, staring into the dimly lit space, his mind a blur of emotions. The image of Rebecca crumpling to the floor, the shock in her eyes as he shoved her, was seared into his memory. He couldn't make sense of it. The anger that had overwhelmed him, the rage that had pushed him to do something so unforgivable, it was like a storm he couldn't control. His fists clenched, the remnants of his outburst still buzzing in his veins. He had never been a violent man, but in that moment, the truth about Rebecca had made him lose his mind. He hated himself for it. But worse than that, he hated the fact that he could no longer trust her. The secret. The deception. It made him question everything. Their entire life together had been built on a lie, and now, all the moments they had shared seemed tainted, as though they were somehow false. Could he ever see her the same way again? Could he ever truly love her again after what had happened? His thoughts spiraled. He had never considered the possibility of something like this. Rebecca had always been the calm to his storm, the constant in his life. But now, everything he thought he knew about her, about them, was crumbling. He didn't even know if he could face her again, not after what he had done. And yet, a part of him missed her. He couldn't deny it. The thought of life without her seemed unbearable, even though the betrayal was still so fresh. The love they had shared was still there, but it was obscured by a haze of anger, confusion, and guilt. He wanted to fix things. He wanted to understand how they had arrived at this point. He needed to hear from Rebecca, to hear her side of the story, but the fear of what she might say, of how she might look at him now, kept him frozen. Hours passed, and Rebecca stayed locked in their bedroom, her mind racing. She replayed their entire relationship in her head, trying to understand how the man she had loved could become a stranger before her eyes. The worst part wasn't even the violence, it was the way David had looked at her, as though he could no longer see her for who she truly was. All of her fears had materialized in that moment. She had always believed that, if he truly knew her, he would accept her, all of her. But now, David saw her as someone else, someone unworthy of his love. The trust had been broken beyond repair. She sat on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands, trying to push through the overwhelming emotions that threatened to drown her. What was she supposed to do now? Was there even a way back from this? The sound of David's voice from the hallway startled her. "Rebecca, I need to talk to you," he called softly, the desperation clear in his tone. She froze, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. She wanted to go to him, to comfort him, to tell him that she hadn't meant for any of this to happen. But a deeper part of her knew it wasn't that simple anymore. The damage had been done, and nothing would ever be the same. David knocked gently on the door, his voice shaking slightly. "Please, just, let me in." But Rebecca didn't move. She couldn't. The thought of facing him, of hearing him speak after what he had done, was too much to bear. And yet, a small part of her wanted to. She wanted to find some way to fix what was broken, to explain herself, to make him understand. But how could she explain the years of fear, of hiding a part of herself that she was so ashamed of? How could she explain the suffocating guilt of keeping such an important truth from him? As the minutes stretched on, the silence between them grew unbearable. The quiet in the house seemed to press down on her, and with each passing second, it felt as though their entire future together was slipping through her fingers. "Rebecca, please." "I'm sorry," David whispered through the door, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I don't know what to do. Please." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't respond. What was there to say? The question wasn't about whether David was sorry, it was about whether their love was strong enough to withstand the wreckage that had been caused. In the stillness of the night, they both sat in their separate spaces, consumed by regret and the weight of the truth. The psychological toll of their confrontation had just begun, and neither of them knew where it would lead. The future was uncertain, and the road ahead was shrouded in doubt, with no clear path to reconciliation in sight. The days following that night in the living room were nothing short of torturous for both David and Rebecca. The house, once filled with the warmth of shared laughter and quiet moments, had become a battleground of silence, the echoes of their argument lingering in every room. Rebecca had retreated into herself, isolating herself from David both physically and emotionally. Every glance at him was a reminder of the confrontation, of the violence that had shattered everything they had built. David tried to reach out to her, his attempts to talk met with silence. The guilt weighed heavily on him, gnawing at him with every passing day. He had never imagined himself as the kind of person who could lose control, who could lash out in anger and hurt the one person he loved most. Yet, in that moment, it had happened. Rebecca had become a stranger to him, and he feared that he had become one to her as well. He spent hours alone in his study, trying to make sense of it all. He could no longer deny the truth that had been uncovered, the truth about Rebecca's past. The revelation had sent him reeling, making him question everything. How much of their life together had been real? How much of it had been a lie? The question spiraled, overwhelming him until he could barely think straight. But the more he reflected, the more he realized that his anger and confusion were rooted in fear, fear of change, fear of losing control, and most painfully, fear of losing Rebecca. Meanwhile, Rebecca wrestled with her own demons. The pain from the physical injury had long faded, but the emotional scars were still fresh, raw, and deep. She had always feared that David would never accept her past, that her transition, her struggles with identity, would be a deal-breaker for him. She had tried so hard to bury that part of herself, to build a life with him as the woman she was now. But now, with the truth exposed, the fear of rejection had become a terrifying reality. She had spent years hiding behind a mask, convincing herself that David loved her for who she was. But now, that mask was shattered, and all she could see was the distance in his eyes, the mistrust, the disappointment. He hadn't hit her physically that night, but the emotional damage was far deeper than she had anticipated. Rebecca knew that she had to find a way to move forward, but she didn't know if David would be able to forgive her, or even if he could truly love her once he understood everything. It wasn't until the third day of silence that David finally found the courage to sit down with Rebecca again. He had spent those days reflecting, trying to clear his head, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't lose her. No matter what she had hidden from him, no matter the pain it caused, he had to try. He had to face the truth, and more importantly, he had to face her. He knocked softly on the bedroom door. The sound felt foreign, tentative, like a plea for permission to enter a place he had once considered his sanctuary. Rebecca didn't answer immediately, but when she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "David, I don't know if we can fix this," she said, her words heavy with doubt. "You're angry, and I understand why. But I didn't want this. I never wanted to hurt you. I just wanted to protect us, protect you from the pain I knew would come if you knew." David's heart ached as he heard her words. He had been angry, but deep down, he knew that his anger was only a reaction to the fear of losing her. "I don't know if I can forgive you for what happened," he admitted, his voice strained, but I also know that I'm not ready to lose you. I can't lose you. He stepped closer, his hand resting against the door frame, as though afraid to cross the threshold into the unknown. Rebecca, I've spent the last few days thinking about everything. About what happened, about how I reacted, and about us. I don't know if I can understand everything yet, but I want to. I need to. Rebecca looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but there was something else there, a flicker of hope, something she hadn't seen in his eyes since that fateful night. She had never expected him to fully understand, but she had hoped that he might find a way to accept her, to accept all of her. You've always been there for me, David, she whispered, her voice breaking. Even when I couldn't be honest with you, you stood by me. I didn't want to hurt you. But I've been living in fear of losing you for so long that I couldn't bear the thought of you rejecting me. I've tried to hide so much of myself, and now, I don't know where we stand. For the first time in days, David reached out, his hand resting gently on the door handle. We don't have to figure it all out tonight, he said softly. But we have to start somewhere. I want to know you, Rebecca. All of you. No more secrets. The words hung in the air, a promise, a plea, and a realization all rolled into one. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat as she looked at him, searching his face for any trace of doubt. What she saw in his eyes was not anger, but a willingness to try. He wasn't giving up on them, on her. I'm scared, Rebecca said, her voice trembling. I don't know if we can move past this. David nodded, his gaze softening. I'm scared too, he confessed. But I want to try. I can't promise it will be easy. But I want to understand you, to understand your past. I want to be here for you. A long silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of their words. Then, slowly, Rebecca stood up and opened the door, the act itself a gesture of trust she had long withheld. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe, allowed herself to believe that there might still be hope for them. Okay, she whispered. Let's try. In that moment, both of them knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that their journey would require patience and understanding. But for the first time since the confrontation, there was a glimmer of hope. David and Rebecca were both standing at the edge of a new beginning, one that would require them to confront their deepest fears, face the truth, and find a way to rebuild what had been broken. The path to healing wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in days, they both believed it was possible. The days that followed their tentative reconciliation were filled with quiet reflection. The silence in Briarwood Heights was no longer oppressive but filled with the weight of unspoken words and unfinished conversations. David and Rebecca had begun the long process of navigating their way back toward each other, but the journey was anything but simple. The wounds they had inflicted upon each other, though deeply felt, were not easily healed. Their path forward was littered with the debris of distrust, hurt, and broken promises. Yet, amidst the pain and confusion, there was something else, something far more profound, a sense of understanding that neither had anticipated. As the days turned into weeks, Rebecca found herself coming to terms with the years of fear and shame that had governed her life. For so long, she had hidden behind a mask, carefully crafting a version of herself that she thought David could love. She had tried to protect him from the truth, thinking that by keeping her past buried, she was preserving their relationship. But what she had failed to realize was that in doing so, she had denied David the opportunity to truly see her. Rebecca had hidden not just her past, but herself, from the person she had become, and from the love that she feared might not be returned if it were fully revealed. One evening, as David and Rebecca sat on the couch together, their fingers lightly brushing, Rebecca turned to him. Her eyes were soft, filled with a sadness she had carried for far too long. I was afraid, she admitted quietly, her voice trembling. Afraid that you wouldn't love me once you knew the truth. That the person I wasn't good enough for you. David looked at her, his face filled with compassion. He had come to realize just how much fear had shaped her actions, how much of their relationship had been built on that fear. "You should have trusted me," he said gently. "But I understand why you didn't. I get it now." The conversation was difficult, but it was a turning point, a moment of raw honesty that neither of them had ever shared before. As David reflected on his own feelings, he too came to an understanding. His initial anger had been born from fear as well, not just of losing Rebecca, but of confronting the truths he hadn't known about her. In his mind, she had been perfect, someone who could do no wrong. But in the process, he had failed to see that perfection didn't come from hiding the parts of us we think others can't accept. It came from embracing all of ourselves, the good and the bad, the beautiful and the broken. David now realized that true love, real love, was not about demanding perfection from someone else. It was about accepting them for who they truly were, flaws and all. He had expected Rebecca to be an ideal, and in doing so, he had failed to see the person in front of him, someone who was battling her own demons, hiding parts of herself out of fear that they would drive him away. Love wasn't about loving the version of someone we want to see, it was about loving them for everything they are, and everything they've been. "I was wrong," David said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've spent so much time focusing on what I thought you should be, I never took the time to see who you really are. I'm sorry for that." Rebecca nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "I don't expect you to understand everything overnight," she said softly. "I just needed you to see me. All of me." As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, the weight of their conversation began to lift. They both understood now that this journey would take time. Trust had to be rebuilt, and the road ahead wouldn't be without its challenges. But for the first time in a long time, they felt as though they were moving forward together, rather than drifting apart. The lessons they learned from each other were not ones that could be easily put into words, but they were profound and life-changing. For Rebecca, the lesson was about the power of vulnerability, of trusting the person she loved with the truth, no matter how difficult it was to share. She had spent so long hiding behind her fears, afraid that being open would cost her everything. But she now understood that real intimacy, real connection, comes only when we allow ourselves to be fully seen, when we trust that the people who love us will accept us, even in our darkest moments. For David, the lesson was about acceptance. He had learned that true love isn't about controlling or molding someone into what we think they should be. It's about understanding and accepting them as they are, flaws and all. His love for Rebecca was not conditional, it was not based on her perfection, but on the person she was at her core, the person he had fallen in love with. The journey of understanding, of truly seeing the one you love, was never easy. But it was necessary. And now, David knew that he would do whatever it took to learn to love her fully, without fear or reservation. Rebecca had lived in fear of losing David, but now, she realized that the greatest act of love was not protecting the other person from pain, it was being honest and vulnerable, even when it scared you. Only through honesty could they truly grow together, and only by letting go of their fears could they rebuild their connection. For both of them, the journey ahead would be difficult. There would be moments of doubt, of pain, and of lingering mistrust. But there was also the promise of healing, of redemption, and of growth. And above all, there was the understanding that love, in its truest form, requires acceptance, not just of the good, but of the bad, the broken, and the imperfect. In the end, David and Rebecca came to understand that love wasn't about perfection, it was about understanding, forgiveness, and the courage to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. They had learned that real love doesn't come with conditions, it comes with acceptance, with trust, and with the willingness to see each other as they truly are. And that, they both realized, was the greatest lesson of all. As the weeks passed, David and Rebecca continued their difficult journey of rebuilding their relationship. The scars from the confrontation, from the secrets and the lies, still lingered. But something had shifted. They were no longer standing on opposite sides of the chasm that had once divided them. They had taken tentative steps toward healing, facing the truth, and learning to accept one another in ways they hadn't before. The tension in the house began to ease, though the silence between them remained at times. It wasn't the comfortable silence of their earlier days, when they could simply exist together without words. No, this silence was filled with the weight of what they had been through. But it was different now. It wasn't a silence born of fear or resentment. It was a quiet understanding, a space where they could both reflect and find their own way forward. One evening, David came home to find Rebecca sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in front of her, her gaze distant but calm. The house was quieter than usual, but in a good way. He had noticed the change in her, the subtle shift that told him she was no longer carrying the burden of guilt and fear alone. He had spent the day grappling with his own demons, but coming home to her felt different now. The anger was gone, replaced with something far more profound, a sense of peace, a new beginning. "I've been thinking," Rebecca said, her voice soft but steady. "About everything. About us." She looked up, meeting his gaze with a vulnerability that had been missing for so long. "I know it's not easy. It's not perfect, and it may never be. But I think we can make this work. I think we can rebuild." David smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and hope. For the first time in a long time, he felt certain of one thing: he wanted to try. He wasn't sure how long it would take, or if they could ever completely erase the pain from the past, but he was ready. He was willing to put in the work, to face the challenges that lay ahead, because he had learned something invaluable in the last few weeks: love, true love, was not about perfection. It was about understanding, about accepting each other's flaws, and most importantly, about growing together through the hard times. "I'm willing to try too," he replied quietly, stepping closer to her. "I've learned so much from you, Rebecca. About love, about trust. I'm ready for whatever comes next. And I want to do this, together." The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was full of understanding. They didn't need more words, not right then. They both knew that the journey ahead would still be fraught with moments of doubt, of pain, and of testing their limits. But there was a new sense of hope between them, one that hadn't been there before. They both understood now that the road to healing wasn't a straight path, but a winding one that required patience, compassion, and an open heart. That night, they sat down together, not in the same way they had before the storm had come, but in a new, more honest way. They shared their thoughts, their fears, and their hopes for the future. They spoke about their shared dreams, about the life they still wanted to build. It wasn't the same life they had imagined years ago, it couldn't be, but it was something new. Something better. They were no longer two people living parallel lives, afraid to truly see one another. Now, they were partners in every sense of the word, walking side by side into the future, uncertain but willing to face whatever came next. David knew that there would be days when the doubts would creep back in, when the weight of their past would feel too heavy to bear. Rebecca understood that her past would always be a part of her, but she also knew that it no longer defined her. She had come to terms with the fact that David wasn't perfect, and that she wasn't perfect either. But what they had now, what they were building together, was real. It was flawed, yes, but it was also beautiful in its imperfection. As they sat there, holding hands in the quiet of their living room, both of them realized something important. The road to true intimacy, to real love, was never about the absence of conflict or the perfect version of each other. It was about honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. It was about growing together, learning together, and forgiving each other along the way. And with that realization, they knew that no matter what happened, they had found something deeper than they had ever imagined. They had found each other. What do you think about David and Rebecca's journey? Do you believe that love can truly survive the kind of betrayal and pain they endured? How do you think they'll continue to rebuild their relationship moving forward? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your opinions and discuss how love, trust, and forgiveness play a role in relationships. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping true crime tales and emotional journeys. Your feedback means a lot to us.